Portland, Oregon, May 15th, 1991. The morning sun cast long shadows across Southeast Division Street as Detective Brian Matthews arrived at Sullivan's Exotic Birds, a specialty pet shop known throughout the Pacific Northwest for its rare collection of tropical parrots and macaws. The call had come in at 7:30 that morning from a concerned neighbor who noticed the shop remained locked well past its usual opening time. What Matthews discovered inside would launch one of the most perplexing missing persons cases in Portland's history. The shop stood eerily empty, its dozens of ornate cages vacant, their doors hanging open. Not a single feather remained. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of overhead fluorescent lights. So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from. Robert Sullivan, 42 years old, had vanished without a trace. More remarkably, so had his entire inventory of exotic birds, a collection valued at over $200,000. The shop's rear entrance showed no signs of forced entry. The security system had been deliberately disarmed from the inside at approximately 11:15 the previous evening. The register contained the day's receipts, untouched. Sullivan's personal vehicle sat in its usual spot behind the building. The investigation quickly revealed troubling inconsistencies in Sullivan's business operations. Federal import documents showed significant discrepancies between the number of birds Sullivan had legally declared and the actual inventory his shop maintained. Customs officials confirmed that Sullivan had made frequent trips to Central and South America over the past 3 years, often returning with shipments that raised questions among wildlife inspectors. Sullivan's wife, Michelle, provided investigators with a portrait of a man she barely recognized. Her husband had become increasingly secretive in recent months, taking phone calls behind closed doors and making unexplained weekend trips. Bank records revealed substantial cash withdrawals, totaling nearly $50,000 in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Michelle had no knowledge of these transactions. Former employees described Sullivan as meticulous and deeply knowledgeable about avian care, but noted his growing paranoia in the months before he vanished. One assistant recalled seeing unfamiliar men visiting the shop after hours, conducting what appeared to be private inspections of the bird collection. Another remembered Sullivan mentioning migration patterns obsessively, filling notebooks with hand-drawn maps and flight trajectories that seemed to serve no obvious purpose related to his business. Investigators discovered a paper trail connecting Sullivan to several individuals with known ties to illegal wildlife trafficking. Phone records showed repeated calls to numbers in Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. A search of Sullivan's home office uncovered correspondence with exotic animal dealers operating in legal gray areas, discussing rare species and encrypted references to delivery schedules. The most intriguing discovery came from Sullivan's personal files. Among routine business documents, detectives found payment receipts made out to a company called Pacific Migration Services. This entity had no registered business address, no tax identification number, and appeared to exist only on paper. Yet Sullivan had paid this phantom company over $30,000 in the 6 months before his disappearance. As spring turned to summer, the investigation stalled. No witnesses reported seeing Sullivan on the night he vanished. No unusual activity had been observed around his shop or residence. The birds had simply disappeared as if they had taken flight into the night, carrying their owner with them. The case file grew cold, but one detail continued to haunt investigators. In Sullivan's abandoned office, they had found a calendar with a single notation circled in red ink for May 14th, the day before his disappearance. The notation read, simply, "Final migration begins." What that cryptic message meant, and where Robert Sullivan had gone, would remain a mystery for the next 3 decades. But the story was far from over. The truth about Sullivan's disappearance and the elaborate scheme he had constructed lay hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right expertise to decode the pattern he had left behind. The weeks following Robert Sullivan's disappearance revealed a man whose carefully constructed facade had concealed a far more complex reality. As investigators dug deeper into his background, the portrait of a simple pet shop owner crumbled, replaced by something far more troubling. Michelle Sullivan sat across from Detective Matthews in late June 1991, pale and exhausted from weeks of uncertainty. Her cooperation with authorities had been complete, yet she struggled to reconcile the man she had married 15 years earlier with the stranger emerging from the investigation. Financial records spread across the detective's desk told a story she had never suspected. The couple's joint bank account showed a stable, modest income consistent with a small business operation. But Sullivan maintained 3 separate accounts Michelle knew nothing about. Over the past 5 years, nearly $400,000 had moved through these hidden accounts. Deposits came in irregular intervals, always in cash, always in amounts just below the threshold that would trigger automatic federal reporting requirements. Sullivan's travel history painted an even more disturbing picture. Immigration records showed he had crossed into Mexico 17 times in the previous 3 years alone. His passport bore stamps from Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil. Michelle had been aware of occasional buying trips for his business, but she had believed these occurred perhaps twice yearly. The reality suggested Sullivan spent nearly a quarter of his time outside the United States. Investigators tracked down suppliers and contacts from Sullivan's professional network. A bird breeder in San Diego recalled meeting Sullivan at an avian trade show in 1988. The breeder described conversations that had made him uncomfortable. Sullivan had asked detailed questions about smuggling techniques, about how certain rare species might be transported across borders without detection, about veterinarians willing to falsify health certificates. Another contact, a wildlife importer operating on the edge of legality, remembered Sullivan differently. This man described a sophisticated operator who understood the international trade in exotic animals better than most professionals in the field. Sullivan knew which customs officials could be bribed, which airports had lax inspection protocols, which shipping companies asked fewer questions. He spoke knowledgeably about hidden compartments in cargo containers and sedation techniques that left no traces. Federal wildlife agents had actually investigated Sullivan's operation twice before his disappearance. In 1987, an anonymous tip led inspectors to examine his import documentation. They found minor violations, issued warnings, but discovered nothing warranting criminal charges. A second investigation in 1989 focused on several rare macaw species Sullivan had somehow acquired despite their protected status. Sullivan produced paperwork suggesting the birds had been captive-bred domestically, though agents harbored suspicions about the document's authenticity. The shop's financial records revealed another layer of deception. Sullivan's official inventory listed approximately 60 birds at any given time, but utility bills told a different story. His electricity consumption had been extraordinarily high, consistent with climate-controlled facilities housing far more animals than his small storefront could accommodate. Water usage similarly suggested operations beyond what the visible business required. A breakthrough came when investigators located a storage unit Sullivan had rented under an assumed name. Inside, they discovered equipment that confirmed their darkest suspicions: industrial-scale incubators designed for hatching eggs, specialized veterinary supplies, crates modified with hidden compartments, documentation in Spanish detailing breeding protocols for endangered parrot species, and most significantly, a ledger recording transactions that dwarfed Sullivan's legitimate business income. The ledger entries used code names instead of real identities. Birds were listed by number rather than species, but the amounts were clear: individual sales ranging from $5,000 to $30,000. Monthly totals sometimes exceeding $70,000. The ledger covered a 3-year period and represented over $2 million in undeclared income. Former employees, when pressed harder by investigators, began revealing details they had previously omitted. One young woman admitted she had been asked to accept packages at her home address, packages she was instructed never to open. A teenage stock clerk remembered Sullivan receiving visitors who spoke Portuguese and Spanish, men who inspected birds with the expertise of professional traders. Another assistant recalled being told to leave early on certain evenings when special deliveries were expected. Michelle Sullivan made a discovery of her own while sorting through her husband's belongings. Hidden inside a hollowed-out book in his study, she found a second set of keys. These opened a safe deposit box at a bank across town, a box Michelle never knew existed. Inside were $20,000 in cash, a passport under a different name with Robert's photograph, and a small blue notebook filled with handwritten entries. The notebook's contents mystified investigators. Page after page contained what appeared to be migration routes, but not for natural bird populations. These were shipping routes, connecting cities across North and South America. Dates accompanied each route. Numbers suggested quantities. Arrows indicated the flow of goods from source to destination. Sullivan had been mapping his entire illegal operation, documenting every movement of contraband wildlife across international borders. The most chilling entry appeared on the final page. Written in Sullivan's neat handwriting, dated May 10, 1991, just 5 days before his disappearance, the notation read, "Network compromised. Primary route exposed. Emergency protocol activated. Final extraction necessary." Someone had been closing in on Sullivan. Whether federal agents, rival traffickers, or both remained unclear. But Sullivan had known his operation was collapsing. The disappearance had not been impulsive. It had been planned, calculated, and executed with the same precision he had applied to his criminal enterprise. As summer gave way to autumn, investigators faced a troubling reality. Robert Sullivan had not been a victim. He had been a fugitive, fleeing consequences that were finally catching up with him. The question was no longer what had happened to him, but where he had gone and whether the intricate network he had built continued operating without him. The blue notebook suggested Sullivan had prepared for this possibility, and somewhere in its cryptic notations lay clues to a destination that would keep him hidden for decades to come. The investigation into Robert Sullivan's disappearance entered a frustrating phase as 1991 drew to a close. Despite the wealth of evidence suggesting criminal activity, authorities could not locate the man himself. The trail had gone completely cold, as if Sullivan had simply ceased to exist. Michelle Sullivan refused to accept her husband's permanent absence. In early 1992, she hired a private investigator named Christopher Hayes, a former federal agent with experience in international cases. Hayes approached the mystery from a different angle, focusing not on Sullivan's criminal network, but on his personal connections and psychological profile. Hayes discovered that Sullivan had been methodically preparing for his disappearance for at least 2 years. Property records showed Sullivan had sold a small cabin in the Cascade Mountains in 1989, pocketing $35,000 in cash from a private sale that barely left a paper trail. He had closed several long-term investment accounts, converting everything to liquid assets. His life insurance policy had been quietly canceled 6 months before he vanished. Throughout the early 1990s, Michelle received a series of anonymous letters postmarked from different locations. The first arrived from Guadalajara, Mexico, in March 1992. The message contained no direct statements, only a newspaper clipping about rare bird species thriving in captivity. The second letter came from Bogota, Colombia that summer, containing a photograph of a scarlet macaw with no accompanying text. A third letter, postmarked from São Paulo, Brazil, arrived in early 1993. The letters never explicitly claimed to be from Sullivan, but they arrived on dates significant to their marriage: their anniversary, Michelle's birthday, the date they had first met. Michelle provided these letters to investigators, who analyzed the paper, ink, and handwriting. The envelopes had been handled carefully, yielding no fingerprints. The postmarks were authentic, but they proved only that someone was moving through South America, not necessarily that Sullivan himself sent them. Federal wildlife officials pursued their own investigation into Sullivan's trafficking network. Agents identified at least 4 accomplices operating in different regions. 2 were arrested in 1993 during a sting operation in Texas, caught attempting to smuggle endangered parrots across the border from Mexico. Under questioning, both men admitted working with Sullivan but claimed they had no knowledge of his current whereabouts. They described him as paranoid and extremely careful, someone who compartmentalized his operations so thoroughly that no single person understood the complete network. International cooperation produced additional leads. Mexican authorities raided a breeding facility outside Monterrey in 1994, discovering birds that matched descriptions of species that had been in Sullivan's shop. The facility's owner claimed he had purchased the birds legitimately through intermediaries, but documentation proved fraudulent. The owner mentioned a North American contact he knew only as Roberto, who had helped establish the breeding operation but had not been seen since 1991. Colombian police investigated reports of an American matching Sullivan's description living in a remote area near the Venezuelan border. When agents reached the location in 1995, they found an abandoned property with evidence of recent habitation and large-scale avian husbandry. Neighbors reported that a foreign man had lived there for several months, but had departed abruptly after strangers began asking questions about him. Christopher Hayes continued his independent investigation throughout the decade, following leads across multiple countries. He interviewed exotic bird dealers, veterinarians, and wildlife smugglers. A pattern emerged from these conversations. Sullivan had been part of a sophisticated international network, but he had not been its leader. He had been a critical node, a facilitator who connected South American suppliers with North American markets. His disappearance had disrupted but not destroyed this network. In 1996, Hayes tracked down a former associate of Sullivan's living in retirement in Florida. This man, now in his 70s and dying from lung cancer, provided the most detailed account yet of Sullivan's operations. He described Sullivan as brilliant but increasingly reckless, expanding too quickly, trusting the wrong people. The old man suggested that Sullivan's disappearance had not been voluntary, that he had fled from threats both legal and personal. Competitors in the trafficking world had grown concerned about Sullivan's growing profile and the attention he was attracting from authorities. The most significant development came in March 1998. Mexican federal police conducted a raid on an illegal animal trading operation in Ciudad Juarez. Among dozens of birds seized, agents discovered a blue and gold macaw with a microchip implant. Veterinary records traced the chip's registration number back to Sullivan's exotic birds in Portland, Oregon. The bird had been cataloged in Sullivan's inventory in 1990 and had been reported missing when the shop was found abandoned in 1991. The discovery electrified the investigation. The macaw provided physical proof that Sullivan's birds had indeed made it to Mexico, and that at least some of his operation continued functioning years after his disappearance. But interrogations of the arrested smugglers produced no useful information about Sullivan himself. The macaw had changed hands multiple times through various dealers. Its journey from Portland to Ciudad Juarez remained murky, passing through numerous intermediaries who claimed ignorance of the bird's origins. Investigators attempted to trace the macaw's movements backward, hoping to identify Sullivan's initial destination after leaving Portland. The effort proved futile. Too many years had passed. Too many transactions had occurred without documentation. The bird had been bought, sold, traded, and transferred through a shadow economy that left no reliable records. Christopher Hayes presented his final report to Michelle Sullivan in late 1999. After 7 years and considerable expense, he had accumulated substantial evidence of Robert's criminal activities and confirmed he had likely made it to Mexico initially. But Hayes could not determine Sullivan's current status or location. He could not say with certainty whether Robert Sullivan was still alive. Michelle made the difficult decision to have her husband declared legally dead in 2000. She needed closure, needed to move forward with her life. The declaration did not end her questions, but it provided legal resolution to a personal nightmare that had consumed a decade. The investigation officially closed in 2001. Federal agents concluded that Sullivan had successfully disappeared into Central or South America, possibly with assistance from his trafficking network. They presumed he had established a new identity and continued his illegal activities under a different name. The case joined thousands of other unsolved missing persons files, gathering dust in storage facilities. But the birds Sullivan had trafficked continued their own journeys. Scattered across 2 continents, living in private collections, breeding facilities, and illegal trading operations, they carried within them a record of their movements. Embedded in their bodies were microchips containing registration numbers and tracking data. These birds were evidence, waiting patiently for someone with the expertise to read the story they contained. 22 years would pass before anyone thought to look for that pattern. And when they finally did, the truth about Robert Sullivan's fate would prove far stranger than anyone had imagined. Seattle, Washington, February 2023. Dr. Danielle Chen stood in her laboratory at the Pacific Northwest Research Institute, studying migration data that refused to make sense. At 38 years old, she had spent the last decade pioneering new techniques in avian tracking, using advanced GPS technology and historical microchip data to map bird movements across continents. Her current project focused on rescued exotic parrots, birds seized from illegal trafficking operations and relocated to sanctuaries throughout North America. Conservation organizations had begun implanting GPS trackers in some of these birds to study their adaptation to semi-wild environments and to monitor breeding populations. Danielle had been analyzing 3 years of accumulated data, looking for patterns that might inform future conservation efforts. What she discovered defied natural explanation. A subset of the tracked birds, all scarlet macaws and blue and gold macaws, showed movement patterns that suggested they had been held in a single location for extended periods before their eventual rescue and relocation. The GPS data revealed something even more peculiar. When she cross-referenced the birds' microchip registration numbers with historical databases, she found that 17 of them had originally been registered to businesses and individuals in the Pacific Northwest between 1989 and 1991. The microchips themselves told a story Danielle had not expected to find. Modern GPS trackers had only been attached in recent years, but the older microchip technology, primitive by current standards, had still recorded basic data about the birds' locations whenever they passed through veterinary facilities or were scanned by wildlife officials. By compiling decades of scattered scans from multiple databases across several countries, Danielle could reconstruct approximate movement patterns stretching back to the early 1990s. 8 of the 17 birds had been registered to a single entity, Sullivan's Exotic Birds, Portland, Oregon. The name meant nothing to Danielle initially, but a basic internet search revealed the 32-year-old mystery of Robert Sullivan's disappearance. As she read through news articles and police reports available online, Danielle realized she might be looking at evidence that had eluded investigators for over 3 decades. The birds registered to Sullivan showed a consistent pattern in their early tracking data. Multiple scans placed them in or near Portland in 1990 and early 1991. Then came a gap in data, a period of several months where the birds disappeared from official records. When scans resumed, the birds appeared in Northern California, specifically in Humboldt County, a sparsely populated region known for its forests and remote properties. The birds remained in that general area for years, based on the scattered veterinary scans and checkpoint data Danielle had compiled. Some stayed as late as 2003 or 2004 before being dispersed through various seizures and trafficking investigations. Their journeys then split in multiple directions, some ending up in Mexico, others in breeding facilities across the southwestern United States, and several eventually making their way to the sanctuaries where they had been fitted with modern GPS trackers. Danielle created a visualization of the data, mapping each bird's journey as a colored line across a digital map of North America. The pattern emerged clearly. Nearly all paths originated in Portland, converged in Humboldt County for a sustained period, then scattered outward. The timeline suggested the birds had been held at a single California location for approximately 12 to 15 years before being moved through trafficking channels. The implications troubled her. If Sullivan's birds had been kept together at one location for over a decade after his disappearance, someone had been caring for them, breeding them, and eventually selling them into the illegal trade. The operation had continued long after Sullivan himself had vanished from public record. Danielle contacted the National Wildlife Crime Unit, a division within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She presented her findings to Special Agent Tyler Morrison, an investigator specializing in exotic animal trafficking. Morrison reviewed her data with growing interest. The agency maintained files on the Sullivan case, though it had been inactive for 2 decades. No one had thought to track the birds themselves as a means of investigating Sullivan's disappearance. Morrison pulled historical case files and compared them with Danielle's tracking data. The correlation was undeniable. Several of the birds in her study had been seized in operations that authorities had never connected to Sullivan. The microchip registrations had been overlooked, treated as routine administrative data rather than potential evidence in a decades-old investigation. Working together, Danielle and Morrison refined the analysis. By examining which birds had been scanned at which facilities and when, they established a more precise timeline. The Humboldt County location had been active from approximately late 1991 through 2003 or 2004. The exact site remained unknown, but the concentration of data points suggested a rural area in the southern portion of the county, somewhere in the remote hill country between the coastal communities and the inland valleys. Morrison initiated a search of property records in the target area. Humboldt County contained vast stretches of undeveloped land, former logging territory, and agricultural parcels that had been gradually abandoned as economic conditions changed. Hundreds of properties fit the general profile, parcels large enough and isolated enough to house a clandestine breeding operation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Morrison discovered that, in 1992, a property deed in southern Humboldt County had been transferred to a limited liability company based in Nevada. The LLC had been registered under a name that seemed innocuous, Pacific Avian Research Group. But the registered agent for the company was an attorney who had previously represented clients in wildlife trafficking cases. More significantly, the property had been sold in 2004, shortly after the last confirmed sightings of Sullivan's birds in the area. Modern forensic analysis of the microchip data provided additional confirmation. Some chips contained not just registration numbers, but also embedded timestamps from their manufacturing dates and initial programming. By comparing these timestamps with Sullivan's purchase records from his Portland shop, investigators could definitively match specific birds to specific purchase dates, confirming these were indeed the same animals that had disappeared with Sullivan in 1991. Danielle's research had accomplished what 3 decades of traditional investigation could not. She had found Sullivan's trail, not by following the man, but by following the birds. The creatures he had stolen and smuggled had become unwitting witnesses, their implanted microchips recording a story that spanned continents and decades. Special Agent Morrison assembled a team to investigate the Humboldt County property. By late March 2023, they had obtained the necessary warrants and coordinated with local authorities. The property sat at the end of a deteriorating dirt road, miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by dense forest and accessible only by 4-wheel drive vehicles. What they expected to find was an abandoned facility, perhaps some remnants of cages and equipment that might provide additional evidence about Sullivan's operation. What they actually discovered would transform the investigation from a cold case into something far more immediate and disturbing. As the team prepared to approach the remote property, none of them realized they were about to uncover evidence that would finally explain what had happened to Robert Sullivan and why his carefully planned disappearance had ended so differently than he had intended. Humboldt County, California, March 28, 2023. Special Agent Tyler Morrison's team approached the remote property as morning fog lifted from the forested hillsides. The location matched coordinates derived from Dr. Danielle Chen's avian tracking data, a 40-acre parcel that had sat abandoned for nearly 2 decades. The main structure was a weathered single-story house with peeling paint and broken windows. Behind it stood what had once been a barn, its roof partially collapsed. But the most significant structures were the large aviaries, a series of interconnected enclosures built with heavy-gauge wire and metal framing. Though deteriorated by time and neglect, the aviary's scale suggested an operation far larger than a simple hobby breeding facility. Morrison's team documented everything methodically. The aviaries showed signs of sophisticated climate control systems, now rusted and non-functional. Electrical conduits ran underground between buildings, indicating the property had been wired for substantial power consumption. Water pipes suggested an irrigation system that had once maintained the aviary's environment. Inside the main house, investigators found living quarters that had been abandoned hastily but not violently. Furniture remained in place, kitchen cabinets still contained dishes, and a layer of dust covered everything. The property gave the impression that its occupant had simply walked away one day and never returned. A search of the house's office revealed the operation's true scope. Filing cabinets contained breeding records spanning from 1992 through 2003, documenting the births, deaths, and sales of hundreds of exotic birds. The records used code numbers rather than species names, but cross-referencing with known trafficking databases allowed investigators to identify many entries as referring to endangered parrots and macaws. Sales ledgers showed transactions totaling millions of dollars over the 12-year period. Buyers were identified only by initials or numbered accounts. Payment methods varied, but most transactions appeared to have been conducted in cash or through wire transfers to offshore accounts. The operation had been generating substantial income, yet the property itself showed little evidence of luxury or excess spending. Investigators discovered a locked storage room that required cutting through a reinforced steel door. Inside, they found photography equipment, record-keeping materials, and most significantly, a safe containing $23,000 in cash, multiple passports under different names, and extensive documentation of international wildlife trafficking networks. The passports were the first direct evidence linking the property to Robert Sullivan. 2 of the documents bore his photograph, though issued under different names. The photos showed Sullivan aging over time, suggesting the documents had been created or renewed at different points during his residence at the property. As the team expanded their search to the property's perimeter, a cadaver dog accompanying the investigation indicated interest in an area behind the collapsed barn. The dog's handler called for the forensic team, and careful excavation began in the designated area. What they uncovered were human remains, buried in a shallow grave approximately 4 feet deep. The body had been interred for a significant period, based on the degree of decomposition and the settling of the surrounding soil. The remains were carefully extracted and transported for forensic analysis. Initial examination suggested the deceased had been male, middle-aged at time of death, and of a height and build consistent with Sullivan's known physical characteristics. The remains showed no obvious signs of trauma or violence, though a complete forensic analysis would be required to determine cause of death. Personal effects buried with the remains included a watch that matched the description of one Sullivan had worn, a wedding ring with an inscription matching the one Michelle Sullivan confirmed her husband had owned, and fragments of clothing consistent with styles from the early 2000s. DNA analysis took several weeks to complete. Samples from the remains were compared against DNA obtained from Michelle Sullivan and from personal items Robert Sullivan had left behind in Portland. On April 19, 2023, the results confirmed what investigators had suspected. The remains belonged to Robert Sullivan. The discovery transformed the investigation's fundamental questions. Sullivan had not been living under an assumed identity somewhere in South America, as authorities had long theorized. He had been at this remote California property all along, operating his illegal breeding operation in isolation until his death sometime around 2003. But if Sullivan had died 20 years ago, who had continued operating the facility after his death? The breeding records continued through 2003 and possibly into 2004. Birds had been sold, money had been transferred, and the operation had been maintained. Someone else had been involved. Someone who had kept the enterprise running even after Sullivan's death. Forensic accountants began tracing the property's financial history. The Pacific Avian Research Group, LLC, that owned the property, had continued receiving income and paying expenses until 2004, when the property was sold to a real estate investment company. The sale had been handled through the same Nevada attorney who had originally registered the LLC, but the attorney claimed attorney-client privilege and refused to identify his actual clients. Investigators discovered that the property's utilities had been disconnected in late 2003. The final bills showed consumption patterns consistent with normal use until approximately October of that year, then an abrupt cessation. Something had happened in the fall of 2003 that had prompted the operation's final abandonment. Examination of Sullivan's remains provided additional insights. Forensic pathologists determined that death had occurred from natural causes, specifically a cardiac event. Sullivan had died suddenly, without warning, sometime between 2002 and 2004, based on the remains' condition and the property's timeline. There was no evidence of foul play. The scenario that emerged suggested Sullivan had been living alone at the property, managing his breeding operation in complete isolation. When he died unexpectedly, there had been no one present to discover the body immediately. Eventually, someone connected to the operation, likely a business partner or buyer who had noticed Sullivan's absence, had come to investigate. That person had found Sullivan's body, buried it on the property, and attempted to continue the operation for several months. But without Sullivan's expertise, the enterprise proved unsustainable. Birds had been sold off, equipment had been abandoned, and the property had eventually been liquidated through the LLC. Documents found at the property suggested Sullivan had been in contact with at least 3 partners or major buyers during his years at the location. These individuals were identified only by codes in Sullivan's records, but investigators began the process of trying to match these codes to known wildlife traffickers. One particularly promising lead emerged from Sullivan's personal notes. References to someone identified as JM appeared frequently in documents from 2001 through 2003. This person seemed to have visited the property regularly and had been involved in major transactions. Investigators theorized that JM might have been the individual who discovered Sullivan's body and managed the operation's closure. As forensic teams completed their analysis of the property, a disturbing pattern emerged in Sullivan's final records. In the months before his death, Sullivan had become increasingly isolated and paranoid. Notes indicated concerns about federal investigations closing in, about partners becoming unreliable, about the entire network facing collapse. Sullivan's careful documentation, the same compulsive record-keeping that had characterized his Portland operation, had continued until very near the end. But the final entries suggested a man who knew his empire was crumbling, who had gambled everything on one final operation and was watching it fall apart. The property's isolation had been both Sullivan's protection and his doom. The same remoteness that allowed him to operate undetected for 12 years meant that when he died suddenly, his body lay undiscovered long enough for decomposition to eliminate many details that might have revealed more about his final days. The investigation had found Robert Sullivan at last, but it had also uncovered evidence of a larger criminal network that had continued operating even after his death. The birds Sullivan had trafficked, scattered across 2 continents, represented not just the scope of his crimes, but the continuing legacy of an illegal trade that persisted regardless of any individual trafficker's fate. Portland, Oregon, June 2023. Investigators assembled the complete story of Robert Sullivan's elaborate scheme, his years in hiding, and the criminal network that had enabled his operation. The picture that emerged was one of calculated deception, unintended consequences, and an illegal enterprise that had operated for over a decade in complete isolation. Forensic analysis confirmed that Sullivan had died in October 2003 from sudden cardiac arrest. He had been 54 years old, alone at his remote property, with no one to call for help when the medical emergency struck. The pathologist's report indicated he had likely died within minutes, a swift end that stood in stark contrast to the careful planning that had characterized his entire criminal career. The reconstruction of Sullivan's movements after his 1991 disappearance revealed a methodical execution of his escape plan. On the night of May 14, 1991, Sullivan had loaded his entire bird inventory into a customized cargo van parked behind his Portland shop. He had disabled the security system, locked the doors, and driven south toward California. His route avoided major highways, taking him through rural roads where traffic cameras and law enforcement presence were minimal. Sullivan reached the Humboldt County property within 12 hours of leaving Portland. The property had been purchased earlier that year through the Nevada LLC, using funds Sullivan had been diverting from his legitimate business. He had spent months preparing the site, installing the aviaries, climate control systems, and infrastructure necessary for a large-scale breeding operation. The property's isolation and the density of surrounding forest made it virtually invisible to aerial surveillance. For the next 12 years, Sullivan lived in complete seclusion. He rarely left the property, conducting business primarily through encrypted communications and carefully arranged meetings with buyers at neutral locations. His operation focused on breeding rare and endangered parrots, producing offspring that could be sold into the illegal pet trade for substantial profits. Financial records recovered from the property showed Sullivan had generated approximately $3 million over those 12 years. The money had been moved through multiple offshore accounts, with Sullivan drawing only modest amounts for his personal needs. The bulk of his wealth remained hidden in accounts that investigators were still working to locate and freeze. The partnership structure of Sullivan's operation gradually became clear through document analysis and interviews with captured traffickers. Sullivan had worked with 5 primary associates, specialists in different aspects of the illegal wildlife trade. One handled logistics and transportation. Another managed sales to collectors in Asia. A third maintained connections with corrupt officials who could facilitate cross-border movements. The associate identified as JM in Sullivan's records was eventually traced to James Martinez, a wildlife smuggler based in Tijuana, Mexico. Martinez had been arrested in 2018 on unrelated charges and was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a Mexican prison. When confronted with evidence from Sullivan's property, Martinez admitted to his role in the operation. Martinez confirmed that he had discovered Sullivan's body during a routine visit to the property in October 2003. The 2 men had been scheduled to finalize a major transaction, but when Martinez arrived, he found Sullivan deceased. Rather than report the death to authorities, which would have exposed the entire operation and his own involvement, Martinez made a different choice. Martinez buried Sullivan's body on the property, using equipment stored in the barn. He then spent the next several months liquidating the operation. Birds were sold through existing channels, equipment was either removed or abandoned, and the property was prepared for sale. Martinez had worked with Sullivan's Nevada attorney to facilitate the sale, with profits being distributed among the remaining partners, according to predetermined agreements Sullivan had established. The attorney, Gregory Foster, faced charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit wildlife trafficking. Foster claimed he had been unaware of Sullivan's death, believing he was simply facilitating a property sale on behalf of a client who had decided to relocate. Prosecutors remained skeptical of this defense, given the suspicious circumstances and Foster's history of representing trafficking clients. The remaining associates in Sullivan's network were identified through the recovered documents and communications records. 2 were already deceased, having died from unrelated causes in 2007 and 2015. The other 2 were arrested in coordinated operations in May 2023, one in Texas and another in Florida. Both faced federal charges related to wildlife trafficking, conspiracy, and money laundering. The birds themselves, those that could be definitively traced to Sullivan's operation, were relocated to accredited sanctuaries where they would live out their lives in protected environments. Dr. Danielle Chen's tracking data had identified 63 birds across 11 facilities that had originated from Sullivan's breeding program. The birds ranged in age from 7 to over 30 years old, representing multiple generations bred in captivity. Michelle Sullivan, now 67 years old and remarried, learned of her first husband's fate with mixed emotions. She had spent 3 decades wondering about his disappearance, cycling through theories that ranged from him being a victim to him being a willing fugitive. The truth confirmed the latter, while eliminating the faint hope she had occasionally entertained that he might someday return. The legal proceedings against Sullivan's associates moved forward through the summer and fall of 2023. James Martinez received an additional 12 years, added to his existing sentence for his role in concealing Sullivan's death and continuing the illegal operation. Gregory Foster negotiated a plea agreement, receiving 5 years in prison in exchange for full cooperation with authorities and the surrendering of financial records that helped trace Sullivan's hidden assets. The 2 associates arrested in May 2023, Kevin Reynolds and Anthony Russo, both pleaded guilty to federal wildlife trafficking charges. Reynolds received 8 years in prison, while Russo received 10 years due to his more extensive involvement in the operation. Both were ordered to pay substantial fines and restitution to wildlife conservation organizations. The financial investigation recovered approximately $1.7 million from various accounts linked to Sullivan's operation. After legal fees and restitution payments, the remaining funds were distributed to wildlife conservation groups working to combat illegal trafficking and protect endangered parrot species. Robert Sullivan's property in Humboldt County was seized by the federal government and subsequently donated to a conservation land trust. The aviaries were dismantled, and the land was allowed to return to its natural forested state, erasing the physical evidence of the operation that had existed there for over a decade. Dr. Danielle Chen's research into avian tracking led to new protocols for identifying trafficked birds and tracing their origins. Her work demonstrated how modern technology could be applied to decades-old data, creating investigative opportunities that had not existed when Sullivan first disappeared. Wildlife agencies internationally adopted similar approaches, using microchip data to map trafficking networks and identify breeding operations. The Sullivan case prompted reviews of hundreds of other cold missing persons cases involving individuals suspected of involvement in illegal wildlife trade. Investigators recognized that other fugitives might have followed similar patterns, establishing remote operations where they could continue criminal activities while remaining hidden from authorities. Michelle Sullivan arranged for her former husband's remains to be cremated. She did not hold a memorial service, feeling that the man she had married had effectively died in 1991 when he chose to abandon his legitimate life for a criminal enterprise. The ashes were scattered in a location she kept private, providing a quiet end to a story that had consumed 3 decades of uncertainty. The final report, issued by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in December 2023, summarized the Sullivan investigation's findings and outlined recommendations for preventing similar operations in the future. The report emphasized the need for improved tracking of exotic animals, better coordination between international wildlife agencies, and stricter controls on property purchases that might be used for illegal breeding facilities. Robert Sullivan's story became a case study in wildlife crime investigation, taught at law enforcement training programs and conservation conferences. His elaborate planning, his successful evasion of capture for 12 years, and the eventual unraveling of his network through modern forensic techniques illustrated both the challenges of combating wildlife trafficking and the potential for new technologies to solve decades-old mysteries. The birds Sullivan had trafficked, those that survived his operation and the subsequent decades, became ambassadors for conservation efforts. Sanctuaries that housed these birds used them in educational programs, teaching visitors about the devastating impact of illegal wildlife trade and the importance of protecting endangered species in their natural habitats. In the end, Robert Sullivan's carefully constructed plan had succeeded in keeping him hidden for 32 years. But his compulsive documentation, the same trait that had made him an effective criminal, had also ensured that the truth would eventually emerge. The birds he had stolen and bred, marked with microchips he could not remove, had carried the evidence that would ultimately reveal his fate and dismantle the network he had built. The case officially closed on January 15, 2024, marked as solved with all known associates either deceased or facing justice. Robert Sullivan's disappearance, once one of Portland's most baffling mysteries, had finally been explained. The man who had vanished with his exotic birds had spent his remaining years in isolation, building an illegal empire that collapsed with his unexpected death, leaving behind only scattered evidence and the birds themselves as witnesses to his crimes.